now is the time. I will develop a case and show my wife the errors of the Catholic Church, and then we can go worship together in presumably a Lutheran church, but at that point, anything Protestant was better than anything Catholic. And that I began, for the first time, to investigate the problems of Catholicism that I had taught were always been taught were grave errors. Mm-hmm. And I started with purgatory because I thought it was the easiest. And I went, and there is a church downtown that was a Jesuit church, and I got little information from walked in with some trepidation, got a couple pamphlets, and went to a Catholic bookstore, and I tried to figure out why Catholics would believe this invention of the Middle Ages, which is what I had been taught it was. And I learned that, aside from a theological argument, again, I was sola scriptura, I wanted to see it in the Bible, that it was based on 2nd Maccabees. So I set purgatory aside and said, I need to address all these extra books of the Bible that the Catholics put in. And that was really what started the dominoes falling, because the historical record is so strong that not only did Christ quote from the Septuagint, but Paul, of all people, quoted from the Septuagint. In the reference
to our audience, the Septuagint is the Greek version of the Old Testament, the Greek translation of the Old Testament.
Which existed at the time of Christ. There was a Hebrew version circulating, but also because there were many non-Hebrew Jews, the Greek was used in Egypt and throughout Palestine. And the early church used the Greek version, and Christ and the apostles used the Greek version, which you know through translation issues. And that came as a real shock to my system. Here I am trying to, in some now comical arrogance, Rick View is going to disprove the claims of the Catholic Church. So that's just audacious, to use a mild word. But it was silly of me to think that I could do this, but that was what my plan was.
You would have felt, though you weren't just a lone wolf in this, that you felt you were on the same team with many, many people that felt the same way that you felt.
And I thought I thought it was going to be easy. I needed to discover the errors and point them out, and I wanted to do it authentically and use, hopefully, the Catholics' own arguments to disprove them. Again, being a litigator at the time, and still am, the easiest way to disprove your argument is to use your arguments against you. And that's just one of the things you learn as a lawyer. So I quickly found myself convincing myself that I was wrong. And I was discouraged by what I had found with purgatory and the extra books of the Bible, which I refer to them as.
I'm not sure we made it real clear. The Septuagint has the other books.
Yes, the Greek version of the New Testament is the same for Catholics and Protestants, for those listeners who...
Both translating the Greek New Testament.
Right. But the Septuagint was the Greek version of the Old Testament, which had, the extra books of the Bible in it, 1st and 2nd Maccabees, critically for my purposes, because the 2nd Maccabees taught that prayers for the dead were beneficial. The clear logic is, if you are in hell, which is a place of eternal damnation, no amount of prayer can help you. If you're in heaven in the eternal presence of God, you do not need prayers to help you. So there must be the middle ground and asking people to pray for the dead. And that was very much a part of the book of 2nd Maccabees. So that was troubling. So I quickly ran to assail the Pope, because I knew from reading the Bible there is certainly no reference to the Pope in the Bible. And what I did to try to investigate that was, why does the Church claim what it claims? And my attention was drawn immediately to the passage, you are Peter the rock upon which I found the church. But I was prepared for that. Being a good Lutheran, I knew what the answer was. Well, he was referring to the profession of faith, not the person, which didn't seem textually accurate, but I was willing to buy that at the time, having been taught it for 20-odd years. But then I said, well, clearly if I can show the early church didn't give any special consideration to the Bishop of Rome, which clearly that was his title, wasn't anything different from my vantage point at the time, then that will prove that this was, again, a later creation. And unfortunately for me at the time, thankfully now, I found the first letter, or the letter of Pope Clement the First. Then I would call him Bishop Clement in Rome, speaking authoritatively to other bishops who he should have been speaking to as a peer, but he was speaking not as a peer. And that was shocking. And at that point,
he's writing from Rome to Corinth.
To Corinth, and more importantly, while John was still living on the island of Patmos, the blessed apostle is alive. If there's a disagreement, so I think we should write a letter to John, the apostle who sat next to Christ at the Lord's Supper. He's right there. We can send him a letter. He's corresponding with the churches. This is about 80 A.D. And I was flabbergasted. None of this computed, and I prayed, what am I to do? And the result of that prayer was I decided I needed to become Catholic, much